Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 177. The Kennedy Murrays. Part 1. An Introduction and Harry Murray VC. Kennedy Murray has a loose link with my husband's family tree. After starting some reading on Kennedy Murray, he proved to be an interesting man. I contacted some people that had public family trees on the Kennedy family, and it was suggested that I get in touch with Cameron Richards, who I was told was an expert on Kennedy Murray, which indeed he is, and here we are. Cameron's a semi-retired Australian professor with extensive lecturing experience in the Asia-Pacific region, and in his semi-retirement, his other main interest has been researching and writing his family history. He's recently published a book that's centred on Kennedy Murray Jr. This is titled Prosperous, The Kennedy Murrays and the Origins of Historic Evandale, where he has uncovered events that have rewritten parts of early Australian history. He's joining me to talk about what prompted him to delve into the Kennedy Murray family and the mysteries he has uncovered in his family research. Welcome, Cameron.
Hi, Nicole.
So first of all, I'd love to know more about Kennedy Murray Sr.
Well, Kennedy Murray Sr. should have been on the first fleet to Australia, but he arrived on the fourth fleet in 1793 as one of the first Scottish convicts in the New South Wales penal colony. This was after voluntarily seeking banishment from the UK for some minor misdemeanours as a 14-year-old in Glasgow.
And tell us about your new book.
Well, it was out the 1st of January. I guess it's several things. It's really an overall family history. It has 15 long chapters. It's quite a long book. And it is also a focus on Kennedy Murray, the son, who was a pivotal person at Evandale. And so the book also is a little bit of a lost history of Evandale and a lost history of Tasmania and a lost history to some extent of early Australia.
So what prompted you initially to delve more into your family history? What gave you that impetus to begin?
It was actually my personal connection to Harry Murray, Victoria Cross. He was a next door neighbour. He was a mentor to my father and he was my great uncle. And I spent decades thinking that one day I might write a book about Harry Murray. There was a statue unveiling at Evandale to Harry in early 2006, the 24th of February, where I discovered that two other people had just written books on Harry Murray. There was a lot of focus on Harry. While visiting Evandale, I noticed that there was a great presence of his grandfather, Kennedy Murray Jr., and the family, and it had somehow been left out of the local history. That got me interested in exploring further both the local history and also the wider family history beyond Harry, who I know was actually interested in questions of his ancestry and was not sure about, which was one of the key items where I got started. When I went to the Harry Murray statue unveiling, the same day there was another ceremony organised by the family, and it was in Pioneer Park for the Kennedy Murray father and son, and there was a memorial plaque. I've got a photo of it in the book, and it was on the side of the original Anglican family crypt, which I will talk about at a later occasion, which had been demolished. It was at that gathering that I first met some of the other family historians. I had one family historian that's a close cousin of mine. He helped to organise the whole day. He was Harry Murray's nephew. He was probably the main Kennedy Murray family historian, but there were a few others at this gathering. And my initial actual interest a few years later, before writing a book, was I actually started to explore the possible ancestry back in Scotland, which I knew was something Harry was also very, very interested in. And seeing the memorial plaque to his grandfather and great-grandfather was what really whetted my appetite to start making an effort to explore the wider family history.
So Cameron, tell me a bit more about Harry Murray VC.
Harry was the brother of my great-grandmother, and on a visit to his two sisters in Launceston in 1948, he ran into my father, who'd just left Launceston Grammar and was about to start a job in the bank. And he knew that my father could ride a horse, so he said, would you be interested in coming up and having a bit of a working holiday on a North Queensland sheep station? And my father decided that was what he was interested in. And he went up and he spent the next 50 years initially working on Harry's farm and then buying a sheep station on a neighbouring property, Clareborough, which is where I, in 1965, going to Christmas at Glen Lyon, because our two families had Christmas each alternate year at the other sheep station, where I have this most vivid memories of Harry. He continued to be a big presence in my life for a lot of reasons. One is he had a big influence on my father, but every time I went to Christmas for the next 20 years, there were Harry Murray items from the war that were in a corner. There was a Kaiser helmet from World War One. There was his own helmet with some bullet holes through it, and there was at least a bayonet, at least one uniform. These are the items that I still remember today that were there, that I'd always think of him every Christmas. And that continued my lifelong interest in exploring further his story. My most vivid memory of Harry as a close relative and a neighbour was of the 1965 Christmas. Both had tennis courts because Harry was a keen tennis player and built a tennis court outside his property, Glen Lyon. At that 1965 Christmas, it's not the only memory, but it's the most vivid memory. It's ingrained in my brain for the rest of my life. So we're all sitting at Christmas lunch. Everybody said he was a shy person. He was not shy when he actually got going and in company. And so he was holding court at the Christmas lunch table and talking very confidently as he did. And out of the corner of his eye, he saw me at the fridge. And I was in the process of committing the cardinal sin for North Queensland sheep stations, and that is drinking water out of the bottle. And I'd taken a bottle of water out of the fridge instead of putting it into a glass. I was only 5 years old. I took a couple of chugs out of the bottle. And Harry yelled at me and roused at me, and everybody turned and looked at me. So I've never forgotten his little intervention there. And so I have several other memories, but that certainly was the main memory that I recall. He had a bit of a problem with his father. He actually got pulled out of school in the 1890s. He was a very intelligent guy and a student of history and wrote very good letters, and he wrote articles for Ravelli AIF magazine in the late 1920s and 30s. His two older brothers had been sent to Launceston Grammar, and then as soon as I'd graduated, they headed off to the West Australian goldfields. And his father was struggling on his farm at St Leonard's. He had a small farm, and he was really struggling. So he pulled Harry out of school, and Harry had to work on the farm, and they didn't have a very good relationship. He always blamed his father. I later discovered a little bit of the backstory, that he would have had much more sympathy for his father if he'd understood the full story that relates back to his grandfather at Evandale. One of the books written was called Mad Harry, authors George Frankel and Clyde Slater. And they actually recalled an episode in the book about how Harry had visited Launceston in 1948 and had met his nephew, Joe Murray Cocker, or Joseph Murray Cocker, or Joe Cocker as I call him, actually probably the main Kennedy Murray family historian. And Joe asked Harry whether he would like to go out and see his father's grave at Evandale. And Harry initially said, I'm not interested. I've got nothing to thank my father for. And a little while later, he changed his mind and said he would. And so Joe drove him out to Evandale to the Presbyterian Church Cemetery, St Andrews, still there today. And Harry saw that his father's grave, which was actually part of the Kennedy Murray, the second family crypt. So they had an Anglican family crypt and a Church of Scotland family crypt, but this was the Scottish one. And he saw it was overgrown, and he, as recorded in the Mad Harry book, he arranged for yearly maintenance to be had on not only his father's grave, but the Kennedy Murray family crypt as well. There were not one Anzac legend in the family. Harry had a first cousin, Charles Augustus Littler, who won a DSO at Gallipoli. And Harry and Charles were captains. Charles was actually more, at the end of Gallipoli, he was known as the Duke of Anzac, and he was probably more famous than Harry at that stage. But Charles Bean was very close to both men. And so I've developed a little bit of a theory that they helped to influence Charles Bean's notion of the Anzac legend, especially in the relation to army officers in the Australian AIF leading from the front, having an often rural background, where values of mateship and resilience were foremounted. I believe that they were family values of the Kennedy Murrays that came down as well through to Harry. Harry was the most decorated soldier in Australian history, with not only a Victoria Cross, but a number of other medals, starting with a Distinguished Conduct Medal that he won at Gallipoli. He also was quite well known from starting the war as a private in the field and getting promoted right through to full colonel in charge of a battalion by the end of the war. He started Gallipoli as a private and had a quite remarkable series of promotions, so that by the time he left Gallipoli, he was a full captain. The Battle of Moquet Farm, which was part of the Somme offensive, was a particularly important, not just for the AIF, but for the family, because within a space of 2 days, Harry not only was wounded, but was awarded a Distinguished Service Order Medal. Meanwhile, his first cousin, Charles, was actually leading. He was sick. He was offered leave, but led a charge against a German machine gun post and was killed. After he was wounded, and he kept going, and all this was mentioned by Charles Bean, who had met him the night before he died. So for the family, that was a particularly auspicious battle. I could probably go into talking a little bit about his medals. So he won 6 and should have been 7. He won a Distinguished Conduct Medal at Gallipoli towards the end of 1915. He won a DSO on the Somme offensive at the end of 1916 at the Battle of Moquet Farm. He won his VC at the Battle of Stormy Trench in early 1917. Certainly all his earlier medals was won for distinguished conduct as an officer leading his men from the front and with remarkable courage. So by the time of the 1917 investiture, which I think was in June, it was the VC earlier in the year and the DSO the previous year. So he must have got the DCM was in the field at Gallipoli. He then won his next DSO, a Distinguished Service Order at Bullecourt, which I think was early 1918. And this was a part of the General Monash series of battles. Now, that's all background to about a year later, Harry turns up as probably the main guest of the 1917 military investiture in Hyde Park, the first for 50 years, and was really the star of the show, where his medals were presented by King George, and King George spent some time talking to him. Harry gets featured in the newspapers, some Murrays in Scotland. The Duke of Athol was the head of the Murray clan, must have seen this because he invited Harry to come up to Blair Castle, Blair Athol in the Scottish Highlands, and to discuss their possible common Murray heritage. And must have been a highlight for Harry, who had always believed that he had a strong Highlander heritage. And there was an interesting side story that turned into a major coincidence. He also on that trip got invited to visit the Montgomery family at Glen Lyon, which was only about 20 kilometres or so from Blair Athol. And he stayed with the Montgomery family and became very good friends with their daughter, believed to have possibly had a romance with Clementine, who he later named his daughter after, Clem. And then he was awarded several additional medals, including when he was seconded by the American Army to assist with their very successful and quite famous advance to break the Hindenburg Line in late 1918. The Americans also recommended him for their own Distinguished Service Order for that battle, but he didn't receive that. It was the only one. There were 2 other ones. He received from the French government a Croix de Guerre, and there was another medal that sometimes left out of some of his records, but he was actually made by the English government, UK government. It's called the Companion of the Order of St Michael and St George, a CMG it's often referred to. So he had 6 medals and should have had a 7th. He was mentioned in dispatches, which is close to winning a medal at least 4 times. So a remarkable military history. And after the armistice, he had a year to go and do a study tour of the UK, and he went to Denmark. And then he came back to Australia. He initially had a farm near Roma, Muckadilla, and he had to go to New Zealand for 2 years and then came back and then found a new property, and it was called Glen Lyon. It must have hit him that this was meant to be. Maybe that's why he chose that particular sheep station at Richmond. In any case, that's where he spent the rest of his life, living in Glen Lyon. One of the things that I found in my research and was able to verify was that it turned out that the Murrays were actually hidden McGregors, and the family are directly descended from one of the pivotal lines of the McGregors that are based at Glen Lyon. The Glen Lyon McGregors of Sir James McGregor, who Kennedy Murray was a direct descendant of. So there's this wonderful Glen Lyon connection, which is reinforced by how Joe Cocker at Labrina outside Launceston bought a little acreage, which 50 years ago he named Glen Lyon. He never knew about that connection, but if he could come back and see family history that we're discovering, would have loved to have seen that connection. Harry Murray also had a smaller but still reasonably significant role in World War II in the Australian military forces. As early as 1939, he had re-enlisted in the AIF and soon found himself appointed commanding officer of the North Queensland-based 26th Battalion, with his original World War I rank of Lieutenant Colonel. The 26th Battalion was formally made part of the AIF and were about to be sent to active service in New Guinea. And at that point, his old senior officer from World War I, General Thomas Blamey, the controversial commander-in-chief of the Australian military forces in World War II, decided to second him to the 23rd Battalion of Volunteer Defence Corps. Whilst Blamey justified some of his controversial transfers at that time, especially dealing with the New Guinea battles at Kokoda, etc., on matters of age and experience, others have suggested that Blamey really was trying to cover up his own deficiencies by getting rid of those experienced officers who would either stand up to him or point out some of those deficiencies, as some apparently done on the New Guinea campaign. Harry Murray was clearly in the second category, not the first. So in any case, he got the transfer, and it was actually one that resonated with him quite well. The 23rd Battalion was mostly made up of North Queensland bushmen. It was a key part of the secret Brisbane line plans in the event that the Japanese invaded Australia, which people today do not realise was a touch-and-go matter in the early 1940s. In that event, the 23rd Battalion were commissioned to engage in a guerrilla war against the Japanese, even behind enemy lines. So this kept Harry very busy, constantly travelling around North Queensland up until mid-1944, when he had to resign because of ill health. There is a postscript to this last story directly related to his World War II activities based in Townsville with the 26th and also the 23rd Battalions. The large Murray Sporting Complex at Annandale was later named in his honour. This complex today remains the main sporting centre in Townsville and one of the biggest in North Queensland, home to netball, basketball, hockey, football, soccer and even a skate park. But by the 1990s, most people had not only forgotten who Harry Murray was, some of the Townsville Council apparently thought that the name was too close to the use of the term Murray to refer to the modern demonym Aboriginal Australians of modern-day Queensland and northern western New South Wales. So at this point, son Doug was then living at Alligator Creek, again a neighbour of my father who had also retired to Alligator Creek just outside Townsville. Doug heard about this plan to change the name and then sent a published letter to the Townsville Bulletin reminding everyone just who Harry Murray was and how the complex had been named in his honour. And so this campaign to change the name quietly disappeared. They had a major ceremony of all the VC winners in 1956 at the personal invitation of the Queen. He actually initially was going to decline that, but eventually agreed to go, where he met up with a lot of his old mates. It was a very auspicious event, coming as one of the great Australian war heroes. It was also publicised quite a lot in Australia. There's two little anecdotes about my father's connection. One was when my father came out to work with Harry at Glen Lyon in 1948, Harry had had two children, and his first child was a son, Doug, and Doug was a year older than my father, and they were a bit like brothers for the rest of their lives, in fact. They remained neighbours even when living in Townsville in their retirement. And there was also a sister, Clem. So one of my father's favourite story was about when Clem got married, the ceremony was held in Adelaide. So Harry very rarely travelled, except for Tasmania. And he only made a few trips to Tasmania over the years to see his sisters, including my great-grandmother. So my father, Harry, got him to drive the car with Harry in it from the sheep station at Richmond, North Queensland, right through to Adelaide. It took about 5 days. There was rain and they got bogged a couple of times. And there was advance notice that Harry was coming, so it had been publicised in the newspapers. The hotel was expecting him, well, the manager was, not the valet, however. So Harry and my father turned up in a car with dust and mud all over it, and they were dressed as my father said, a bit like hobos. So the valet told them to disappear before the manager luckily came out and knew who Harry was and then corrected the situation. So my father dined off on that story for many, many years later.
I could imagine he would have. That's funny.
Doug was very, very shy. So anybody interested in family history or actually interested in Harry Murray and his medals actually had to go through my father. And there were a lot of people. The Australian War Memorial tried to get the medals for many years. And in fact, it was said that at the statue unveiling, they had taken down Harry Murray's portrait from the Australian War Museum in Canberra because Doug had refused to donate the medals. I'm not sure if that's 100% true, but certainly that was a big topic at the 2006 statue unveiling to Harry. And in fact, a year or so later, they put the portrait back up. And a few years later, after Doug had died, Clem actually gave the medals on loan to the Australian War Museum, where they are presently. They are there, but on loan. They were never sold. There are a lot of private buyers that tried to buy it. And again, they had to go through my father. So my father also told the story of some mining executives from Western Australia because Harry worked for a number of years around the Kalgoorlie area. And so some mining executives turned up, wanted to offer Doug and the family several $1 million. And that's over 20 years ago. And Doug said no. And so he was determined to keep those medals in the family. So in 1966, it was only 2 weeks after the Christmas episode that I just recalled a few minutes ago, Harry was driving down with his wife, Nee Cameron, and down to the Sunshine Coast, I think it was, and around about Condamine or Miles was involved in a car accident. The car rolled. And then the next morning, he actually had a heart attack and died. And so he was actually 86 years old. He was born on December 1st, 1880 in Evandale, and he died somewhere in mid-Queensland in January 1966. His family attempted to have a quiet funeral, but the word got out, and there were a lot of old friends in the AIF, and so he eventually had a funeral with honours in Brisbane, attended by many military personnel, and the family went down as well. And so what was meant to be, because he really didn't like a big fuss about him and all through his life. But I think everybody felt that justice was done, that there was a proper recognised funeral to celebrate his life. And that was, as far as the family was concerned, was also very suitable and agreeable, and very happy that that's the way it turned out, even though that was not the original plan. A number of people, including his biographers, have commented on Harry's regular failure on record to remember his true birth date. And this was especially so when he enlisted in 1914 and then again in 1939 into the Australian Military Forces, plus when he got married to Nell Cameron in 1928. Harry was actually born on the 1st of December 1880 at Clareville in a cottage on the old John Sinclair farm that was paid for by shooting and killing one of the Brady gang in 1828. Harry was baptised in 1885, but often used that date instead of 1880 as his birth year. So why was that so? In 1914, when he first enlisted in Western Australia into the AIF, they were screening off a lot of the older recruits. And we have no doubt that the reason that Harry stated his age as 29 instead of 34 at that point was to ensure that his enlistment application was successful. A bit like the many youngsters wanting to enlist in the First World War who put their ages up to 18 for the same reason. In fact, one of them was another great uncle of mine who enlisted at 16 and had actually died during the first battle of the Somme before his 18th birthday. Nell was just 21 when the then 45-year-old Harry separated from his first wife. Nell was actually the niece of Harry's first wife, Constance, and they took off together to New Zealand, where Harry married Nell in late 1927. Following the finalisation of his divorce from Constance. Putting his age 5 years down there seems to have been a bit of a vanity gap, that he was so much older than Nell that he wanted to lessen that. So some of Harry's memory lapses were perhaps excused by his keenness to fight for the Australian Military Forces, but in the case of his marriage, perhaps a bit of vanity was involved, and surely he can be forgiven for this.
Part 2 is going to be covering Kennedy Murray Sr.'s early life, and Cameron will be covering information on Kennedy Murray Sr., who was the first family member to come to Australia. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.